Ever had that moment, where your computer just decides to go kaput and you realize you haven't backed up those vacation photos? Ugh, the
This
worst.
is like a punch to the gut.
But what if there was this awesome technology that could make those data disasters a thing of the past?
Well, that's where OpenZFS comes in. It's not just your average file system. It's like a fortress for your data.
A storage revolution? Is that what we're talking about here?
It's a big claim, but
Yeah.
honestly, OpenZFS has the goods to back it up. And, it's been around longer than people might think.
Oh, really? I'm intrigued. Take us back then.
So picture this. It's the dot-com boom, right?
Yeah.
And OpenZFS gets its start at Sun Microsystems.
Fancy pedigree.
Right. And since then, the open source community, they've really taken it and run with it, adding their own innovations and really making it something special.
And that open source aspect, that's kind of a big deal, right? This is part of why we're diving into OpenZFS today. But before we get too deep into the weeds, can we take a step back? What makes OpenZFS so different from, say, the file system I'm using on my laptop right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of times people hear file system and they think, okay, it's just how my computer organizes my files, right? But OpenZFS, it's so much more than that.
Okay, unpack that a little. What are we really talking about here?
Okay, so imagine this. Your hard drives, in their natural state, right? They're kind of like individual musicians, each with their own unique sound.
A recipe for sonic chaos, maybe.
Exactly. Now, traditional volume management, it's like a producer trying to wrangle them into, at least playing in the same key. You might get something resembling music, but it's limited.
And that's where OpenZFS enters the picture, like a conductor.
More like it brings all those hard drives together into what's called a storage pool. It's like taking those solo musicians and forming a symphony orchestra.
So instead of separate instruments, you have this big cohesive sound,
Precisely. Your data doesn't see a bunch of separate drives anymore.
right?
It just sees this one massive, beautiful storage space.
Okay, I'm starting to get the picture. But for someone like me, who mostly just uses their computer for, everyday stuff,
Hmm.
what's the aha moment here? What does this actually mean?
Think about those dreaded low storage warnings you get, right? With OpenZFS, you can just effortlessly expand your storage by
Yeah.
adding more drives to the pool. No more scrambling to free up space or buy a whole new, bigger drive.
Okay, yeah, that alone is pretty impressive. But, having all that space is great. But what happens if my data gets corrupted? That's a whole other nightmare.
And that's where OpenZFS really sets itself apart. With its focus on data integrity, remember that analogy about the symphony orchestra? Imagine one musician suddenly deciding, you know what? I'm going to play some polka in the middle of Beethoven's Fifth.
Talk about a musical train wreck, right?
Yeah, exactly. It'd be chaos, right? And that's kind of what data corruption is like. It's like your computer's language just gets all scrambled. But OpenZFS has this really clever way of preventing that from happening. It's called copy on write.
Copy on write. Okay, that sounds kind of important, but break it down for me. What's actually happening there?
All right, so let's say you're like, a composer and you're working on this big, amazing musical score. Now, you wouldn't want to make changes directly to your original manuscript, would you?
Too risky, right?
Mm.
One spilled coffee and it's game over.
Exactly. So instead, you make a copy, and then you make all your edits and changes on that copy. That way, you always have the original to go back to.
So if you mess up, no big deal, you've got your backup.
Precisely. And that's essentially what OpenZFS does. Whenever you make changes to a file, it doesn't just overwrite the original data. It writes those changes to a brand new area, keeping your original data totally safe and sound.
So even if, the power goes out right in the middle of saving a file or the system crashes,
OpenZFS just goes, no worries. It just reverts back to that last perfectly good copy of your data. It's like having a time machine for your files.
okay, no more frantic file recovery attempts. I can get behind that. But speaking of keeping data safe, let's talk about redundancy for a second. Because we all know having multiple copies of your data, that's just good practice. So where does OpenZFS fit into all of that?
Absolutely. Redundancy is key. And that's where RAID comes in, right? Redundant array of independent disks.
Which is basically like having backup singers for your data, right?
That's a great way to put it. But here's the thing. Traditional RAID systems, they have this, well, it's kind of a scary sounding vulnerability called the write hole. Imagine you're saving like a huge video file, and right in the middle of the save, the power goes out.
Oh no. Tell me my cat video survived this scenario.
Well, with traditional RAID, you'd be in trouble because it might have only written part of that file to the disks. And that partial write, that's what leads to corruption.
So it's like a book with half the pages missing. It's just not going to end well.
Exactly. But here's where OpenZFS comes to the rescue again. It has something called RAID-Z. It's like RAID, but, it's been to the gym, it's stronger, smarter, and most importantly, it totally eliminates that whole right hole issue.
Okay, I'm listening. RAID Z. How does it work? How does it pull off this magic trick?
Think of it this way. Traditional RAID is kind of like building a house of cards. It's fragile, one wrong move and the whole thing collapses. But OpenZFS with RAID-Z, that's like building a fortress.
Okay, I like the sound of that. A fortress for my data.
Right. So with OpenZFS, it makes sure that your data is written to multiple disks, but it does it in a very specific order, and it verifies that every single bit of information is written correctly.
So even if one of my drives decides to kick the bucket,
Your data is still safe. OpenZFS has got your back. But wait, there's more. Remember those rewind wishes we were talking about earlier? Well, OpenZFS has another trick up its sleeve, and it's called snapshots.
snapshots. Okay, you're going to have to explain this one. Are you telling me OpenZFS can, like, rewind my data?
Sort of. Imagine taking a picture, right? But instead of just a photo, it's a snapshot of your entire storage pool at that exact moment.
So it's like a save game feature, but for my whole system.
You got it.
Hmm?
Let's say you're about to do something, I don't know, maybe install a new operating system, something that
Okay.
could, potentially make a mess of things.
Oh, yeah. Been there, done that. Didn't end well.
Right. But with OpenZFS, no problem. You just create a snapshot before you start. Then if anything goes sideways, you just revert back to that snapshot. Boom, just like that. Like nothing ever happened.
That's wild. It's like having a safety net for your whole system. I
Yeah.
love it. But those snapshots, they must take up a ton of space, right?
That's the amazing part. They're actually super space efficient. See, they don't create like a full copy of all your data every time. They just record the changes made since that last snapshot.
Oh, that's clever. So you could theoretically have, like, tons of these snapshots without your hard drive freaking out.
Exactly. And that makes it so easy to just take snapshots all the time, even multiple times a day if you want to be extra cautious.
Wow. OpenZFS, you're blowing my mind here. And I'm hearing there's even more to it than this. We haven't even covered everything.
Oh, there's a lot more where that came from. OpenZFS is jam-packed with features like inline compression, for example. Basically, it's like having a built-in space saver for your data.
Okay, compression. I like the sound of that. More space on my drives. Yes, please.
Right. It's essentially shrinking down your files without actually losing any information. Kind of like magic, but it's really just some seriously smart engineering at work.
Very cool. What else we got?
Well, there's something called the Adaptive Replacement Cache, or ARC for short.
Adaptive replacement cache. Sounds like something out of Star Trek.
It's pretty futuristic. Think of it like this. It's like this super smart assistant for your storage. It's constantly learning, analyzing how you use your data, and then it automatically starts caching the stuff you use most often. It keeps it ready to go right there in RAM.
So the stuff I use all the time loads super fast.
You got it. Makes your whole system feel so much snappier. And of course, we can't forget about security. OpenZFS has got you covered there too with native encryption.
Yeah, encryption's kind of essential these days, especially if you've got sensitive data you need to protect.
Absolutely. And with OpenZFS, you can encrypt your entire storage pool, so everything's locked down tight.
So even if someone swiped my hard drive, they wouldn't be able to get to my data without the encryption key.
Exactly. OpenZFS gives you real peace of mind. It's like having a digital vault for your data, really.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. I mean, we've talked about storage pools, snapshots,
Yeah.
RAID-Z, encryption. It's safe to say OpenZFS is in a league of its own.
It's powerful, it's flexible, and honestly, it's incredibly resilient. Like, this is a file system that truly cares about keeping your data safe. And the best part is, it's open source, which means it's constantly being improved and updated by this global community of, really passionate developers.
It's been a wild ride, that's for sure. For our listeners who are now, completely hooked and want to dive into OpenZFS themselves, where would you recommend they start?
The OpenZFS website is a great place to start. They've got tons of documentation, tutorials, you name it. And honestly, don't be intimidated. There's a ton of information out there for all levels, from complete beginners to, the tech wizards out there.
Yeah, everyone's welcome. And hey, who knows? Maybe one day we'll be looking at OpenZFS as the gold standard, the file system on every device. Imagine a world where data loss is just a distant memory, where our computers and phones are basically indestructible data fortresses.
I can get behind that dream. And honestly, with OpenZFS, it feels like we're well on our way.
Well said. And on that note, we're going to have to wrap things up for today's deep dive. Hopefully you've all enjoyed this little journey into the world of OpenZFS. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those hard drives happy.